Thank you very much. Very good. So I just have some questions I'm going to run through for each of the panellists, and then we'll have a chance for a bit of question and answer from the audience. So to begin, Bryce, how is our current refugee quota making New Zealand look in comparison to the rest of the world?
Okay. Hi Steve, thanks everyone, and thanks for inviting me along tonight. I guess in some ways it's a funny question, because why should we care what people think? We should be making these decisions on the basis of right and wrong. What's the right thing? What's the right moral answer? But nonetheless, it really is the focus globally at the moment. Everyone is starting to ask, each country what they're doing. So the scrutiny is being applied, and New Zealand's going to come under focus. So people are going to be asking, are you bringing in 7,500 refugees as part of this crisis, or are you only taking 750? So, that's going to be the case. And already, people will be looking at what our quota is. And of course, as we know, it's 750, which is pretty pitiful. And, I wouldn't blame anyone around the globe for looking at New Zealand and saying we're heartless people, that New Zealand is a bad global citizen. I think that would be fair enough. So, certainly, we've had this belated announcement today, which I guess we'll come back to later on. But I think, we're seeing just so much more scrutiny, even within New Zealand, about our own reputation from newspapers, editorials. There was one last week from the Dominion Post, saying our pitifully small intake is a stain on our international reputation. And I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the problems is we just have such low horizons in New Zealand politics about lots of things. But the refugee quota is just the epitome of that. 750 is just so small. And it just troubles me a bit that even the other political parties, and I acknowledge the Greens have done a lot for leading the campaign, for making us think about a higher number than 750. Still, with them suggesting 1,000 isn't really a huge improvement over that. So I think we need to be looking at much bigger numbers. We need to think big, really, like one Prime Minister used to talk about. Actually, in terms of the Greens, I saw a headline in the news the other day on the internet. What it read, the headline was, Greens leader calls for emergency intake of 20,000 Syrian refugees. And I thought, yes, Meteria's spoken out. She's got bold, and she's gone for a large number. And then I read it, and it was about the Australian Green Party. And yes, they're a bigger country, but nonetheless, I thought, wow, 20,000, wouldn't it be great if that was the level of conversation we were talking about in New Zealand at the moment? And I mean, we do have to look at the big numbers at the moment. And so just, before coming along here, I just looked at, the fact that Germany, 800,000 they're taking in. And that's the context we should be talking about. They announced today that they are spending an additional 8 billion euros on the refugees coming in. Norway, a similar sized country to us, they're taking in 8,000. So when we look at the government's announcement today, we should put it in that context. Rwanda, a country of 12 million, they're taking in 70,000 just this year from Burundi. Looking at some of the debate around, just in New Zealand, I noticed that the spokesperson for the Syria New Zealand Solidarity group, he was talking about 10,000. That would be a good figure. I was looking at some blogs today. One urban design blogger was talking about a figure of 50,000 would be quite good. Christian churches today came out, and they said just the Christian churches alone could take on 1,200 at a minimum. So I think these are the big sort of numbers we should be thinking about, and it's a bit embarrassing that today's figure announced by the government is only 750. And even that number, of course, is a bit of an illusion, because 150 of that is going to be within the quota, so you're left with another 600 that's spread out over a few years, and really it just means we're having about 200 extra a year, which isn't even one a day in a global crisis. So I think our global reputation still might suffer, even though we're having this big announcement today that is going to supposedly save our reputation and supposedly save the reputation of John Key. It really is the bare minimum. And yes, it does cost money. We acknowledge that. to bring in and save lives. But, it's all about priorities, isn't it? And so today's announcement, I think, was going to cost an extra $47 million for these refugees to come in. It's only twice what we're paying on the referendum for the flag. So, saving 750 lives, flag referendum, you can think about your own priorities yourself. But even if you look at what the government spent on other things, we had the Rugby World Cup, the government pitched in $300 million for that. Even the America's Cup, it wasn't even hosted here, the government pitched in $36 million. So these are sort of the big numbers we've got to think about when we're contextualising today's announcement from the government. But I guess what I'm saying is an answer in a long way to your question is that I think New Zealand's reputation is suffering at the moment. I'm not sure that today's announcement is really going to repair that damage.
I'd hate to think it's about reputation.
Yeah.
One thing that when you visit the camps and you meet the people, you suddenly realise it's not about numbers. As a numbers game, it's a problem that's too big globally to fix, but every person who gets asylum, who you take in, that makes a huge difference to that person's life. So every one extra is one extra person who is going to have a quality of life that they were otherwise not going to have. So, Bryce, what would be the effective policy situations when adopting a larger quota? So what are the things that we'd have to look at?
Okay, I'm next, I realise. Okay, certainly I view it quite positively. I think that the policy ramifications give us a chance for innovating. Obviously we're going to have to think outside the box if we're going to go beyond 750 new refugees. Or even if we are going to, we're going to have to particularly think about geography, about where these refugees are going to be settled. Obviously they can't all go to Auckland. There is capacity in Auckland for some innovative thinking about use of some sort of resources there. If you think back to during the war, US soldiers came and set up barracks in lots of places of Auckland, in the Domain and Western Springs. But I think we should be thinking outside Auckland and thinking about places like Dunedin, in fact. As we know, Dunedin doesn't accept any of the quota refugees at the moment. We have the Minister of Immigration. He's from Dunedin, but we don't actually accept any. I think we should be changing that. Obviously we've got much cheaper housing, we've got employment needs here, but there's heaps of rural areas throughout the country that would benefit from refugees. And of course, one of the big, myths about refugees is, although they do have these upfront costs that we pay, refugees and all migrants add to the value of the economy. They come in, they become producers, they set up businesses, they also work, they buy things. They're a net addition to the economy. And I think that's what would happen if we suddenly had resettlement centres throughout the country, that there would be a boom for those places. And certainly, as a regional development policy, this would actually be a positive thing for New Zealand. But nonetheless, there was a really good documentary, or a small mini documentary on TV3's The Nation on Saturday, looking at how we currently resource the resettlement centre, and it doesn't really seem that we're putting enough resources in. So there are questions about our current policy in terms of how we run that resettlement process. So I think there probably is, it probably would be a good idea to have an independent review at the moment into how we do our resettlement. And it should be involving places like Dunedin, and it should be looking at all sorts of ways to accommodate an influx of new people.
Great. Metiria, as an MP, what expectations do you have, what experiences, I have to put my glasses on. What experiences have you had in dealing with refugees who have settled in New Zealand?
Less here than in Auckland, when I was the MP in Auckland, and I've met with a number of refugees who wanted to talk to MPs about what their experience is and ways that we can help with various things, particularly around social services, which they were struggling to get good quality access to, as most people do in New Zealand these days. community I worked most closely with was the Tamil community, and it was a real eye-opener, I guess, in working with a whole community of people who had been escaping civil war in their own country, people who were freedom fighters for self-determination in their own country and who had come here. They came with a real respect for Māori culture, because they themselves were Indigenous people fighting for their rights as Indigenous people. They came, they wanted to understand more about what it meant to be Māori here. Their Senior Citizens Association in Auckland, they have a celebration every Waitangi Day and sing their own national anthem, the New Zealand national anthem and the Māori version of the national anthem, just as a kind of way to symbolise their value, the way that they value this country and the opportunities it provides them and their kids and their grandchildren. It was interesting talking about their experience to New Zealanders. Actually was a slightly more difficult thing often, and trying to get New Zealanders to understand that these people were Indigenous people, they were freedom fighters looking for self-determination, they had enormous connection to Māori in particular, but New Zealanders in general, and looking for new opportunities in this incredibly rich, resourceful land. And that therefore we needed to be much more open to working with people who were refugees and migrants, that there was a lot more connection than differences, being more open around language, which they really struggled with, particularly trying to get access to New Zealanders to talk to on a regular basis so that they could learn English. And it's these kinds of ordinary human interactions that we in our own country experience all the time, being able to sit in forums like this and have a conversation. It's very difficult when you come here without your family, or with very, very few of your family, with some trauma from where you've come from, wanting to engage and finding actually it's quite difficult to do so because the community isn't that open to allowing that engagement to happen. So that was sort of the dominant kind of experience I had when working with refugees, particularly in Auckland, less so now that I've been in Dunedin.
There's less refugees to work with here.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Bryce. I think there's politics is the art of the possible, unfortunately. It is a struggle just to argue to increase the quota after 26 years, 28 years, or whatever it is? 28 years, and we are still having an argument as to whether or not to increase it by a quarter, from 750 to 1,000. It has required enormous amounts of public pressure and terrible stories, like daily stories from the media. I mean, in the Herald, on their website, 1.9 of 15 stories in their politics section were all on the crisis in Europe. It's required a massive investment from the non-government sector to get government to take the crisis seriously enough that they're even doing the little that they are with the extra 600 today. And on top of that, there's been, it's really great that New Zealanders are now really engaging with the debate and saying we want people into our homes, we're opening ourselves to them and their needs. But it is not something that's going to end with getting more people here. What's happening in Europe at the moment is massive. What is happening in Africa has been massive for years and years and years. And so, this is something that we have to build into the way that we understand ourselves, the best of ourselves as New Zealanders, and build it into our system so that we do. We have centres all around the country. We have a much more progressive approach to their integration. We're much more open as a country around language and integration and supporting communities and different cultures. We make the investment because we consider it to be part of our contribution to a just and sustainable planet, a just and sustainable world. And so it's going to be more than just dealing with this particular issue. It's a long-term investment we have to make as humans to the rest of our human society.
Thank you. One of the things I've noticed on TV recently and the news media is that we're focusing so much on the crisis in Europe, but really there is no crisis in Europe. There's a lot of people looking for somewhere new to live. The crisis is happening at sea where people are drowning, and the crisis is happening in Syria Africa, where people are being executed, where there's genocide, where there's bombings and there's starvation. Yet we're very focused on Europe and an influx of people. And I think it's quite sad in a way, because our focus is becoming on something that we see as manageable because it affects the West, and it's taking our focus away from the reason those people are there.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's true.
Lucia, it says here that you spent 8 years in the Middle East working as the head of Newswire service. It must have been very interesting.
Yeah, I was a journalist there for about 9 years.
9 years? That's
Newswire, yeah.
very interesting time. Through this position, what type of exposure did you have to refugees and displaced people, and what kind of lives were they living?
I think my time in the Middle East was a little bit unusual. First of all, it was with the national newspaper, and then it was with the head of a newswire service. So I didn't just get to speak to people that were coming into the country, but to the politicians and the authorities and the rulers who were really making decisions about lots of things. And what was really noticeable, and it's been mentioned before, is that all these crises have been going on for so long. And I was surprised by the fact that over time so many people were going into Dubai because they didn't want to be in any other part of the Middle East, no matter how awful it might be. It's a lot better than anywhere else. And they were there, and they weren't classed as refugees, even though they were refugees, because the Gulf countries are not a signatory to the 1951 Convention of Refugees. So these people could afford to be there. They could afford to pay for visas, which is a lot of money, and to keep doing that. Now, what happens to these people when, you know, or to many people who can't afford to go there, people who don't have passports, and I met a lot of people who didn't have passports, people who would say to me they were there, they might have come from Pakistan or Afghanistan, but they, if they had a choice, they would have gone to, what shocked me, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And I thought, well, what's that going to do to these countries? It's not Europe. Europe, and I learned this when I also did the documentary, is that people go to Europe because it's easy. They don't necessarily choose to go there, but it's easier for them to access. And New Zealand doesn't allow, New Zealand's focus is really actually on Asia Pacific. So people, for the most part, have to get to that part of the world before they even select it to come into the country. So there are a lot of issues about that. So I met also, I was really influenced by a Syrian friend of mine. She had actually left Syria a few years earlier, a Christian, and she had fallen out with the Assad regime. So she had come there, she was there, she had got her papers to be in the country, but the rest of her family, all of them over time, were shot. They were all killed, though she was from Homs. And I was really shocked by that, and she went to the embassy, she went to all the main embassies to try and leave Dubai, to be considered a refugee, and nobody would allow her, nobody would accept her. She was not considered a refugee, even though in actual fact in any other country she might be, and nobody wanted to hear her story. And I was quite shocked by that. She went to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all the European embassies, and nobody could be bothered. So I suppose I was influenced by all those things. There was a whole lot of different things. Actually, when I came back here to New Zealand last year, next to me there was a Saudi guy. Well, he wasn't Saudi, he was Sudanese, but he had been brought up in Saudi. And the way it works in that part of the world is you actually have to have a sponsor to stay in the country. And even though he had been born there and his family was there, he couldn't go back to Saudi. He then didn't know what to do because he was married to an Indian, but he was from Sudan, but his passport was Sudanese, but he never lived in Sudan. But he wasn't allowed back to Saudi Arabia. So he said to me, what can I do? I said, well, from what I hear from your story, you could probably ask for asylum in New Zealand. He was an engineer. And as it happened, I was able to put him onto a lawyer who could help him, and about 3 weeks ago he actually got asylum. So I was quite shocked by that.
Wonderful. Actually, I'm in touch with 2 Sudanese gentlemen lost in Jordan at the moment who might like to hear about that process.
Yeah, it's really complicated. So there was just a whole sort of, a whole many issues, I suppose, in the Middle East that affected me, and also because I spoke to rulers and regulators, and those who have money have a lot of money, and those who have none, and they're quite prepared to use those who have no money to their own ends, and it goes on.
Thank you. Mostafa, this question I imagine could actually take us all night.
Yeah, it's the largest question, answer to the question.
It is. So the question for Mostafa is that as a refugee from Iraq, if you would like to tell us a story about becoming a refugee and arriving in New Zealand.
Sure. So, is this mic working? Yeah. So, firstly, thank you for having me on the panel. This story starts, like I'm assuming a lot of stories, with a father. His name is Mostafa Alwash, and he's a doctor that has, for a majority of his life, devoted himself to charitable causes. At the moment, he's working with Doctors Without Borders in conflict zones around borders such as Sudan and Kenya, trying to preserve life or sustain it if he can. So during the 1980s till 1988, Iraq and Iran had a very devastating war, and it left the infrastructure lacking and desiring. My father acted as a medic in this war. The next war that came to Iraq was the Gulf War between 1990 and 1991. In 1991, my father got injured by shrapnel in his lung. And so we were somewhat relocated. But since my family was considered Shiite Muslims, we were somewhat exiled or discriminated because of that fact. So we went to a southern city called Kalar in Kurdistan. And so one day, soldiers and tanks arrived in the streets, and they just started destroying absolutely everything. The hospital, the streets, the electricity, everything. So the ones that did survive abandoned the place, so my father was left there in a demolished hospital with thousands dying around him. And as his duty, it was his responsibility to bury these bodies. So after that, my father made a decision. He wanted to take us to safety, and so he traced a route to Iran and back. The next day, we all gathered as much fuel as we could, and we just drove for the Iranian border. It was somewhat bittersweet to hear some stories from my brothers cheekily saying about the actions of my father. In one case, he read the Quran to a man in his deathbed in the hospital. So once we arrived to Iran, things calmed down quite a lot. We ran into the Salvation Army, and they had a huge network of tents to support everybody, and it was really nice meeting people in the same kind of situation. So we stayed there around 70 days, and an average meal would be, say, a boiled potato with salt. So from there, it was a point in my life where I appreciated the factor of a family. I always feel my heart completely goes out to those people stuck in refugee camps that are displaced or are missing some of their family. So from Iran, again, there's somewhat of a discrimination. My father had to recredit himself for 2 years and then get paid a third of a Persian person's wage. And so he collected as much as he could, and then he registered to go to New Zealand. And because of the fact that he's a doctor, we were lucky to get that, unlike a lot of other families in the same situation. So in terms of the first question, that is my somewhat experience. and so we have 5 siblings, my father, my mother, a sister, and 3 brothers, one of which is my twin. So me and my twin were the youngest, and we are only a couple of months old when I was around 1 year old when we crossed the border, and we stayed in Iran for 6 years. In terms of the second part of the question, what was the experience? I think it was layered because I was shielded by some of the horrors that was faced in war. My father took the brunt of it. He was a witness to multiple executions. He had the responsibility of all these lives around him, and as a doctor, that's something to your core. Me and my brother, as I said before, we're somewhat shielded. We couldn't interpret what a tank is, what happens when a life is lost, whereas my older brothers, their experience would be quite traumatized, to be honest. They saw multiple families killed, including our neighbors where we lived in Kalar.
Thank you. Certainly a very sobering story. I was going to talk a little bit later on actually about my trip to Jordan and meeting families in Zatri refugee camp in particular, where every family has a very similar story. And when you hear about the atrocities and the daily lives, you then start to understand why people are piling into unseaworthy boats and making that perilous journey across into Europe. Bryce, how would adopting a larger quota affect our foreign policy and how we appear in our reputation with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I guess it would make us look a bit less ridiculous within the OECD because currently, of course, our quota is ridiculously small. It's about a quarter of what Australia's quota is per capita. So even if we doubled it, though, would only be up to half what Australia is doing per capita. So it would be a bit less ridiculous. But in terms of foreign policy, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I don't teach in foreign policy. I normally deal with domestic politics, but nonetheless, I think we do have to talk about foreign policy when we talk about New Zealand's involvement with refugees, because it is, intrinsically related to foreign policy. And the reality is that New Zealand has been part of this Western alliance that has been involved in these danger zones, these in the Middle East, in Africa, whether it's going back 100 years and how these colonial countries have been divided up very badly by our allies, until even coming to more recent times with Western intervention has caused this problem. It's been the destabilising effect of the bombings in all these different countries by Western countries. So we've actually created this refugee problem. And I think you can make that argument about every single country that's producing refugees at the moment. We've exploited these countries in lots of economic ways, and then we've gone and dropped bombs on them, and we've directly caused these people to flee. And so it's actually now our responsibility to mop up some of the mess. So it's not about New Zealand being charitable in our foreign policy, it's actually about us taking responsibility for what Western countries have done. And that's why we should be taking a massive amount more than 750 at the moment. Because we've tried to push our weight around in the world. We've tried to send our armies into these other countries, and this has been the result. So we're making amends, and New Zealand doesn't have a very good record in dealing with the outcomes of these military interventions. So I think finally we do have to start making amends and pumping in a lot of money into these other countries, into these refugee camps, and taking a lot more than 750 people in the next, not just 3 years, but immediately.
Thank you. Metiria, what do you believe are the political and policy implications of doubling the refugee quota?
I don't think there's any major implications at all. I think it's just a question of resources and scale. So the agencies who work with refugees now are saying that they're already they're pretty stretched, largely a result of excuse me, poor funding over a long period of time. They want to be able to scale up, and they could do so, given a bit of notice and the resources. So that's not a policy issue, that's simply a question of prioritising this piece of work over some other things, and Bryce has described some of those other things that we might consider to be less of a priority than taking more refugees. So when Denise Roach developed her members' bill to increase the permanent quota to 1,000, that was done in conjunction with agencies who work with the refugees, and I think Amnesty International too at the time. It was in June of this year, so quite separate from what's happening at the moment, and there's no major policy implications at all. It's simply a question of resourcing. I think if we were to go down the track, which I think we should, which we've explored a bit, which is having a much more consistent and structured approach to increasing the number of refugees that we take overall, and having good quality structures around the country as part of an economic development strategy, if that's how you want to look at it. It's part of a community development strategy, if you want to look at it from that point of view, as part of our engagement with the world on the world stage, as a country that is diverse and celebrates that diversity, which might be another way of looking at it, then yes, having structures where you have refugee centres around the country in regional areas with good quality support for those social services that are needed, and a very high quality engagement with the public about the value of having people come and be engaged in your community, and good ways of connecting the community with refugees who come. I think it would be an enormously valuable policy and political consequence for the country as a whole. It would genuinely open us up as a country that does celebrate diversity, that puts us on the world stage as living up to the rhetoric. All the rhetoric about punching above our weight and all of those things that you hear all the time, we never actually do, or certainly not in the last 10 years. So, we would live up to some of that rhetoric, and we would be our community, our country would be so much more, just so much more better as a result of that. So I think that's really, if we were going to take this issue seriously, the real policy and political implications are more resources and structuring it better into our systems.
Great, thank you. What do you say to people who talk about the effect it has on working New Zealanders, on those who are struggling now, and say that we should be looking after our own first?
Is that for me?
This is for you.
It's not an either or. There is enough to go around, actually. This country is an incredibly wealthy country with amazing resources, natural resources, with amazing economic resources, actually, that we just don't use wisely enough. We don't use fairly enough as it is. And we could use them more fairly, and if we did so, we would be able to share them more widely with more people. There'll always be some who are just not into it, and you can't really do too much about that. What you can do is make sure that New Zealanders, everybody who's here, whether you have been here since Mairongo, for forever and ever, or you've just recently arrived for whatever reason, people have got access to decent housing, decent jobs that pay properly, the community is healthy and therefore engaged, and there's good schools and good infrastructure, and people feel that there's places that they can engage with the rest of the community in all sorts of different ways, sports and culture and all the things that makes a good life. Then we have massive capacity in this country to increase our population, to bring in more people, and to be much more open to new people and new ideas. There's nothing. But but at the same time, we live in a country where our resources aren't being fairly shared, where there is a growing gap between rich and poor that is making many people feel so much more defensive about the meagre resources that they currently have access to. Social services are getting harder and harder to access by people who desperately, desperately need them. So, people are going to be more fearful about what they might lose access to when at a time we're here there is a large population. There's 305,000 children living in severe poverty. So the feelings are real, and the needs of New Zealanders now who are living in those very desperate situations is real, but this is not an either-or situation. It's a question of getting rid of some of the greed and sharing the resources more fairly.
Thank you. Lucia, we're having the opportunity this week to see your documentary, which is Stepping Up, New Zealand's Response to the Refugee Crisis. What motivated you to create this, and why do you think it's so crucial that New Zealand does step up?
Well, I came back to New Zealand last year, not before all the crisis as we know it started, but I came back with the knowledge that I actually want to do something on the Syrian crisis, which I couldn't do because there weren't enough people in New Zealand, and New Zealand hadn't taken anybody in at that stage, so it all became much wider than that, looking at refugees, looking at interviewing refugees and asylum seekers, and looking at New Zealand's response to that. But I had also come from a part of the world where it is very authoritarian, where there isn't a lot of humanity or tolerance. And I actually thought I was coming back to a place where people really wanted to come here, that it would be humanitarian and that would be tolerant. And that was the approach, in a way, that I took to the documentary, asking whether New Zealand was actually stepping up to the mark, whether it was really meeting those aims. And in a way, so as a consequence, I started to try and look at the economic impact of refugees, which is why in the end I looked principally at the second generation refugees, because for the most part they give back a lot to New Zealand. They become very well qualified, and everybody said, they become the doctors and the lawyers, and a lot will go back to their own country and try and give back, and they all said they wanted to give something back to New Zealand. It's the first generation, which is more of a problem in terms of integration, simply because they can't speak the language. The second generation have the opportunity to learn the language over a longer period of time. So I wanted to look at those economic impact, and I found that the refugees gave a lot back, but the New Zealand government was really not doing very much. As we know, the refugee quota hadn't been increased for 28 years, and everybody I spoke to wanted the quota to increase, and they were quite prepared for it to be increased over a period of time to allow the government and the communities to ensure that there was enough funding available for the refugees, that they would get a quality of care, that there'd be a quality of resettlement. And I learned over time that that actually wasn't happening. For a lot of refugee families, there was a lot of problems in terms of the resettlement. One of the issues, it's been brought up, how much funding goes towards refugees. I think in the last year, I was trying to remember, I think it was something like 7.8% of government funding went towards refugees in 2013, but most of that was to border control. It wasn't actually going to the communities at all. It's going to border control to stop people coming in the first place. And that was really quite worrying. And the other thing that came up a lot was the concern, the language people were using around the idea of illegals, queue jumpers, and making an assumption that anybody that came on as an asylum seeker was an illegal, and they're not. They are by right allowed to do that in the same way that a refugee can. The difference is that with a refugee, they are in New Zealand being part of the UN system, that they are selected by New Zealand. They are actually, people go in and choose. Now you can ask, are they the right people that are being chosen or not? I don't know, but there are not a lot of them. And in terms of Syria, which was originally my focus, I did manage to get to Mangere when the first 50 refugees had come into the country, and many of them were really unhappy because they didn't speak English and they didn't know what they were going to or what they had left. They left families behind. What they also wanted was to be reunified with their families. I mean, that was another big issue that came up. But there was something like only 83 refugees, Syrian refugees, I think, came into New Zealand up until July this year. I mean, that's just tiny when you think, and they talk about increasing to 750. For a lot of the time, the figures are actually not correct because the government doesn't actually meet the figures, the reunification figures, as you know, they've changed in the last couple of years. But for about 5 years before that, those quotas were never met. So I sort of learned quite a lot about all that along the way. And I also agree with what's been said. You know, a few weeks ago there was an event in Queenstown, and what was quite interesting is that the people there actually said, actually, can we do more? We would take in refugees. We know where they would go. But Red Cross, of course, the services are not available, and the government chooses not to make any of those services available throughout the country. So that is what is so ridiculous. And Christchurch, they say, oh, we can't. Christchurch is, you know, understandable. There is a housing crisis in Christchurch, but I think there was only 3 went to Christchurch in the last intake. So stepping up was really all about trying to address those issues and look at the economic impact.
There's also a labour shortage at Christchurch, so.
Well, yeah, they bring in Filipinos to try and sort that. So there's another big issue around that too. So that's really, yeah.
Thank you. Mostafa, if you could tell the audience what you're doing now, and also what you really think refugees want when they come to another country. What is it that they're looking for?
Yes, I'm pursuing my PhD in information science. Why I'm doing this is because I'm honouring the opportunity that my father gave to me by coming to this country. Your second part of the question was, what do refugees want? The first thing is human rights. That's why they leave their culture. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to leave their culture. No one wants to leave their families, their friends, their belongings. But it's just something we have to do for the continuation. One of the biggest points, I think, was all they want is a fair opportunity for a future for their kids.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next set of questions are for the entire panel. So just feel free to really speak up, first in, first served. Is doubling the quota enough?
It's a start. It's a start. And I think if we got both, because of public pressure, which means there's public support for increasing, and therefore the political shifts, then we might be in a better situation to talk about how we can do better than that. And it would be the first major breakthrough in more than 20 years. Yeah.
I think doubling the quota is like an easy sell for the media, for other people. You know, you can say double the quota, but it doesn't end there. The most important thing is to ensure that the people who come here have a quality of life. And that comes from the resettlement services to not just the funding from the government, but the way the communities distribute the funding between them, how the services, you know, how they work. In fact, I think somebody mentioned America's Cup funding. In one of the interviews I had with trauma recovery services, he said, well, the money that we want from the government would cost less than it cost the government to fund an America's Cup campaign. I thought it was really quite valid.
One thing I noticed during the week, watching Breakfast TV of all things, was most people seem to be really unaware of how low the quota is. They're saying double the quota. What is it now? 5,000. They seem to have no idea, and when they find out that the quota is 750, they seem shocked and embarrassed. Most New Zealanders seem to have no idea what our baseline number is for the quota.
Can I also say on that, though, the reason why the quota was introduced in the first place was way back, you know, by Ozzy Malcolm, and I spent a bit of time interviewing him, was to do with Cambodia. It was to try and just formalise some program when the Cambodians came in, because until then it was the churches, it was the communities that were being looked after, and he felt that there was sort of fatigue around that. But we're going back to that now, going back to actually saying, what can you give us as a community?
I think the Double the Quota slogan has served a good purpose, and it's understandable, and I really respect what Amnesty International and other groups like Doing Our Bit have really done for pushing forward the agenda of increasing the quota. But I sort of feel like we're moving beyond that now, that we've got this global consciousness raising, really, where people are actually moving ahead of some of those old demands. And so globally, people are just, we've got this amazing chance at the moment where everyone's talking about refugees. Everyone's talking about how can we help. And yes, there are still some elements of xenophobia and Islamophobia that are in part of the debate. There's some conservative voices here and there, but they're actually the minority for a change. I've been following, the refugee debate and the quota debate for, a few years now, and it's been a bit depressing. And certainly looking at the wider public's orientation to refugees and that 750 figure. And I have been quite amazed how people are pretty negative about it. Especially talkback and on the internet and stuff. But that has suddenly just changed, in the last few weeks. And suddenly we do have this opportunity to have much higher horizons. And people's hearts are really being opened. And suddenly we're seeing that yes, there are lots of negativity, and there's lots of conservatism, in the public, but that's kind of melting away, a lot of it. And human nature, I think, is generally positive, and people do want to help other people. And yes, we might have a political culture in New Zealand whereby there's a lot of aggression between political parties, and there's a lot of negativity, and we focus a lot on what's wrong with other people that aren't like us, whether they're different nations or different ethnicities or whatever. There is a lot of that in politics. I think that's being superseded by people having this genuine desire to change the world. So I think at the moment we should be, fostering that, and I really respect what some of these organisations are doing, because they are, like I say, changing the world.
Is it a case of a single photo that has been a tipping point, which has changed views?
I think that photo, there were other photos like that before, and there have been some since. I suspect that one of the reasons why it was so compelling was because the child was dressed and looked just like any of our kids. It was very much, it could have been a child who had tripped over on the beach and fallen on his face. You watch your kids do that all the time when they're playing. He was wearing clothes that looked like we'd bought them from the warehouse, and it was exactly the clothes that our kids wear every day. So there was a very visceral connection at a very, very human level. There was really no parent in the world, I don't think, who could see that photo and couldn't see their own child there. And it was less less shocking than some of the previous ones had been as well. And so even that, I think, made a difference, because it was so real and so possible. That it drove and has driven so many people to look at the whole issue more closely and to want to do something about it and be connected is fantastic. That does show that we all do belong to the human family. We want to help. We want to change the world, and we will do so wherever we can. So there's a lot of criticism about the use of the photo and the sharing of it, and there's been criticism of political parties over the photo, and you'll get that. But it doesn't undermine just the sheer emotional power of it as connecting us to every child in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. The photos of the children and having been to some of the camps and met a lot of the children, you can't but see them as just like your own. I have a friend who is recently, actually is missing currently in Aleppo, who I've been talking about in the ODT recently. He's a school teacher who's writing for a website that I founded about 6 months ago, and he was kidnapped along with the Spanish journalists, and he's dedicated his life to, the rest of his family has left Syria and are in Turkey, and he stayed behind, has dedicated his life to raising funds to support Aleppo school children. Before he went missing, he was regularly sending me photos, and some of them are pretty horrific, which are the shots that you see of after barrel bombs have been dropped on that city, and on schools, and some things that were just completely disturbing. But the shots that I enjoyed the most, and I think that everyone seems to love on the website, are the happy, smiling children that they relate to as being just like theirs. The next question I think we kind of covered before actually, which is was around the monetary side for how would we respond to objections to raising the quota. I was wondering if we could branch that out into the Islamophobia, the xenophobia, the idea that New Zealand is a Christian country and that this will change the face of the country, and how you would respond to that.
I never read the comments on anything, so if that's where you sit.
What I'm talking about here is talkback comments.
I think you have to sort of just, well, in New Zealand, yes, it's a Christian country, but a lot of countries say they're Christian countries. And what I've noticed here is that people, when it comes to Islam, have absolutely no idea, A, what Islam is about, or if there is a difference. They say, oh, there's a difference between Sunni and Shia? Oh, they're all the same. No, they're not. And it's that lack of awareness, I think, causes fear. I think that's just...
I agree.
The idea that not all Muslim people are extremists or have an extreme viewpoint, I think seems to be lost on many New Zealanders with the media. And I think one of the positive things, if there is a positive thing with recent media, is that we are hitting a tipping point where the conversation has changed. And I think that's very important in getting people to see people as people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You look at how the mainstream media is covering what's happening in Europe, and yes, you're right, how you said at the start, it's not a crisis in Europe, but it is a political crisis in the sense that the politicians, well, some of them don't know how to handle it, but it's amazing watching the media. I was watching BBC World last night, and it was just incredible watching how crowds were clapping when they were having refugees arriving in Germany, and they were being embraced.
Yeah.
And so you get a sense of the humanity that yes, there's a bit of xenophobia here and there, but I think the images we're seeing are kind of challenging a lot of that, and I think this might be quite a landmark time in the West's orientation to other cultures.
But actually, can I just make, I've noticed, because I read the press from the Gulf, what is quite interesting now is that when you're there, you know that despite the fact that they're so-called wealthy, the 6 GCC countries don't take any in refugees. That's not what they do. But now, even within inside those countries, people are calling for them to take in refugees, and actually now to help an Arab country, which Arabs are actually not very good at doing. I've told Arabs that too, so.
I think Bryce is right though, that right up until this point, the only story we ever hear about what's happening over there is ISIS.
Yeah,
that's right. All we ever hear.
Yeah, negative stories.
Massively negative stories. If someone if the media students out there who did an analysis over the last, 12 months, maybe a bit longer than that actually, since the great Get Some Guts speech, then have a look at the media, New Zealand's media approach to issues that are happening in that region, and seeing this shift away from the constant alarmist stuff around ISIS to what's happening now in Europe. I think it would be a very dramatic shift. And so people are hearing a whole different series of messages, not about this this particular group of people, but actually the whole population. And they look just like us, and they do things just like us, and they live in towns just like we do. And that's shifted a whole kind of concept around it. So it is very interesting.
It's humanising people.
Yep.
Yeah. It would be fascinating to do a media analysis of it, actually.
Yeah.
Actually, I found that a few weeks ago when there was a debate in Queenstown, and there was some dear Hazara from Afghanistan, and he was speaking, telling him about his journey. His father had come out on the Tampa, and about him being caught in the detention centres in Australia, and his whole family was there, and his sister, who wears a hijab, and she's very beautiful, but she wears, and I had people coming up after and saying, really? But they're just like us. Or even though she wears a hijab, they're just like us. And that was quite because they related to them, because you were talking about normal people, and these people were good looking.
What do you think? Because we're kind of talking about you.
It's kind of subjective, I guess. What is appealing to one may not be to another.
Exactly.
I think everybody is a brother or sister, so I think all people are beautiful, I guess, mutual.
But what's your experience living in Dunedin? Do you feel welcome in the city?
Of course I do. There are certain minorities that would tease or, try to seclude or such, but they're ineffective in a large part. There seems to be a theme along the majority that there is a solidarity between people, and you don't have to go far to see that.
The final question that I have here, I think we've actually strayed into and answered, and that was about what do we really need to do to change awareness and public opinion to support doubling the quota and creating more access. Any sort of final comments on that?
Well, I think I just want to reiterate, I think it's the importance of raising awareness so people don't have fear, because I think it's fear that causes a lot of the uncertainty and lack of tolerance.
Yeah. And when they can see it, people are people just like us, that fear goes.
I think it's important to make the issue political, and that's what's been happening recently, and that's what's part of the reason it's become a success. And it's the success of Amnesty International and Doing Our Bit and other civil society organisations that have really pushed the agenda, and they've used politics in lots of different ways. They've used it at the elite level. They've been lobbying the Ministry of Immigration, other political parties. They've been involved at grassroots level as well. And I guess I would, that would be my answer, that everyone needs to get political about it. And it doesn't have to be in terms of joining a political party. There's lots to be involved in being political about the refugee issue.
The biggest political risk now is that people will think today's announcement of an additional 600 over the existing quota is sufficient, and therefore drops the campaign. It's close to doubling. It's not permanent, but it's going to be hard to get the complexity of that message out, that it's a good start but not enough, which is, when the other side can argue, well, we've close to doubled, we're going to put in 40-something million and we're doing everything we can. It sounds like a good thing. So the big risk now is that the campaign can lose momentum because there is a half step forward. And really, we all know that major change is what's necessary, and we need to keep pushing for that major change. So I think there is those of us who are involved or who support improving the situation significantly will need to keep on it and make sure it doesn't lose strength over the next few months.
I think that's really important. I make my living, when I'm not a journalist, as a spin doctor, and the fact that 750 was chosen by the government today is absolutely no coincidence. It absolutely takes the public's eye off the ball and hides the fact that, as you were saying, really it's an extra 200 a year. And I think we're going to need to work really hard to cut through what was a clever but reasonably obvious bit of spin, I think, today from the government. Finally, questions from the audience. Does anybody like to ask any of our